I arrived alone, carrying an invitation that felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the paper, but because of what it represented. The ballroom was already alive when I stepped inside, washed in light and noise and youth. Cameras flashed, champagne glasses clinked, laughter floated freely, effortless and careless. I stood there, 60 years old, wearing a plain gray suit, and understood immediately that I did not belong in this room anymore. A group of young models passed by me, their perfume sharp and sweet. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "The wallet is here." They giggled like it was the cleverest thing in the world. I felt the word land, not like a slap, but like a final confirmation. This was how I was seen. Not as a husband, not as a partner, as a function. No one introduced me. No one asked who I was. I was the man behind the curtain, finally dragged into the light and stripped of mystery. As I stood there, invisible in a room built on what I had carried for nearly 3 decades, I realized something with unsettling clarity. Silence had protected me for years. Tonight it would expose everyone else. I did not know yet how the night would end. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not a story about a man being humiliated. This was a story about a man who had finished being erased. The ballroom overlooked Manhattan floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the city like a promise. The skyline glittered in the dark, all confidence and ambition, as if nothing beneath it ever cracked. Everything in the room screamed success. The music, the lighting, the expensive fabrics draped across impossibly young bodies. Linda's world, carefully curated, perfectly staged. My wife's name was everywhere, on banners, on programs, on lips that praised her vision and her courage. People spoke about her as if she had built something out of nothing. They talked about her talent, her drive, her independence. I listened quietly. My hands folded my face, neutral, wondering how many of them would still be smiling if they knew who had funded every inch of this illusion. My suit was clean-pressed and deliberately unremarkable. Linda had hated it. She used to say it made me look small next to her. I wore it anyway, not out of defiance, out of habit. I had learned long ago that drawing attention only made things worse. The models glided past me again, practiced smiles fixed in place. One of them looked at me openly. This time her eyes scanning me like an object, something replaceable, something already used. I felt the familiar urge to leave, to step back into the background where I belonged. But I stayed. I needed to see this through. I spotted Linda near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers. She was radiant, dressed in emerald green, her hair flawless, her posture confident. She looked powerful. She looked untouchable. When she laughed, people leaned in closer, eager to catch her attention. This was her moment, the one she had been chasing for years. For a brief second, she looked at me, not with warmth, not with recognition, with calculation. Her smile sharpened, and she excused herself from the group around her. As she walked toward me, the energy in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. People sensed something was about to happen. Cameras angled in our direction. Phones rose quietly. "Elias," she said, her voice carrying just enough to command attention. "You made it." I said I would, I replied. She studied me the way one inspects something before deciding what to do with it. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a thin folder. White, clean, deliberate. She held it out to me between 2 fingers, as if afraid it might stain her. "I'm famous now," she said louder this time. "I don't need a nobody husband anymore. Sign the divorce and leave." The words landed in the open space between us. Clean, final, unapologetic. For a moment, no one breathed. The room froze, suspended between curiosity and discomfort. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, waiting, hoping, expecting something dramatic, anger, begging, shame. I took the folder from her hands. It was lighter than I expected. "Congratulations on the launch," I said quietly. Her eyes flickered just for a second. Confusion. That was not the reaction she had planned for. She stepped back, recovering quickly, her smile returning thinner now. "I think it's best for everyone," she said. "You understand?" I nodded. Around us, whispers spread like a ripple through water. I heard someone laugh nervously. Another voice said something about security, just in case. The models watched with barely concealed amusement, already framing the story in their heads. The older husband, the upgrade, the inevitable ending. I did not look at the papers. I did not read a word. I closed the folder gently as if it were something fragile. "I'll take care of it," I said. I turned and walked away. Behind me, the music resumed a fraction louder than before. Applause broke out near the stage as if nothing had happened, as if a marriage had not just ended in front of a room full of strangers. The elevator was mercifully empty. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. I looked older than I felt, tired, but steady. A man who had been carrying weight for so long that he barely noticed when it was set down. As the elevator descended, the noise of the party faded into a distant hum. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone there, solid and familiar. I did not take it out yet. I did not need to. For nearly 30 years, I had been careful, quiet, reliable. I had built my life without applause, without recognition, without asking for credit. Tonight, that silence had been mistaken for weakness. The doors opened onto the cool night air of Manhattan. I stepped outside alone, the city stretching endlessly in front of me, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. I walked toward my car, already knowing that the moment I touched my phone, everything would change. The night air outside the hotel felt sharper than it had any right to be, as if the city itself had decided to wake me up. Manhattan never slept, but it did judge. I could feel it in the way the wind cut between buildings, in the way taxis rushed past, without slowing, indifferent to whatever private collapse had just taken place 40 floors above. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The applause, the music, the carefully staged celebration were already receding into something unreal, like a memory that belonged to someone else. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, blending instantly into the crowd of strangers who had no idea that my marriage had just been pronounced dead in public. For the first time all evening, I noticed how calm my body felt. My chest wasn't tight, my hands weren't shaking. The humiliation had been sharp, yes, but it hadn't broken me. What hurt far more, I realized, was how long I had accepted being treated as invisible. If I reacted now, if I let myself feel everything at once, I would be playing her game. I had spent too many years reacting. Tonight required something else. My car was parked a block away, squeezed between two luxury sedans that cost more than my first house. A familiar sight. Linda had always hated that car. She said it embarrassed her, said people would think she was married to a man without ambition. I never argued. I just kept driving it. When I slid into the driver's seat, the engine started on the first turn of the key. No hesitation. No drama. Dependable. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, letting the quiet settle in. This car had carried me through years of early mornings and late nights. It had taken me to work while Linda slept. It had waited patiently while she shopped, while she lunched, while she planned the life she believed she was building alone. It had never failed me. Unlike the woman upstairs. I pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, driving without urgency. The city lights blurred past the windshield reflections, stretching and dissolving like promises that never quite materialized. I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts for once. Halfway down the avenue, I pulled over and parked. This was not a decision I wanted to rush. I took my phone out of my pocket and held it in my palm. It felt heavier than the divorce papers had. I scrolled to a familiar name and tapped the call button. "Elias," the voice answered, almost immediately. Calm. professional, expecting this. "It's time," I said. My voice didn't waver. "Freeze the business accounts, all of them." There was no surprise on the other end, no questions, just the soft sound of keys tapping. "Understood," he said. "Effective immediately. That includes vendor payments," I added. "Yes." I ended the call and sat there staring at the dark screen. Money doesn't disappear loudly. It doesn't announce itself or make a scene. It simply stops moving. And when it does, everything built on its motion begins to wobble. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was relief, like locking a door that should have been closed a long time ago. I made the second call without hesitation. My attorney answered on the second ring. "Proceed," I said. "Revoke usage. File the paperwork tonight." There was a pause, brief but loaded. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." "All right," he said. "It'll be done." I hung up and leaned my head back against the seat. The illusion Linda had built so carefully was already cracking. The brand she paraded as hers was nothing more than a name she had borrowed. A doing business as. A mask. The structure beneath it had always been mine. She never asked whose name things were in. She never wanted to know. She trusted visibility. I trusted paperwork. My phone buzzed in my hand before I could put it down. "Linda." I let it ring. It buzzed again and again. Calls stacking up, each vibration more insistent than the last. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. I could picture her now. The confident smile faltering. Someone pulling her aside. A whispered word. A problem, a delay. She would brush it off at first. Linda always did. Problems were for other people to solve. I pulled back into traffic and drove home. The streets were quieter the farther north I went. The noise of the city softened into something more manageable, something human. By the time I reached our neighborhood, the adrenaline had faded completely, replaced by a steady sense of purpose. The house was dark when I arrived. Every light off. Still. Waiting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind me. The silence felt different here. Heavier. More personal. Linda's perfume lingered faintly in the air, an expensive scent she insisted on wearing even at home. It used to comfort me. Tonight it felt like clutter. I walked past the living room without stopping, past the kitchen where I had eaten countless meals alone, past the staircase that led to a bedroom that no longer felt like mine. I went straight to the room she avoided. My office was in the back of the house, tucked away where practicality mattered more than appearance. No artwork, no mirrors. Just shelves, files, a desk worn smooth by years of use. Linda had called it depressing. Too dark. Too serious. She never understood that this room held everything real. I turned on the light and closed the door. For a moment I simply stood there, letting the quiet wrap around me. This was the space where decisions were made, where plans were built slowly, patiently, without applause. This was where I had survived. My phone buzzed again on the desk. I glanced at the screen. Missed calls. 7, then 10, then 12. I didn't listen to the messages. I didn't need to hear the panic yet. Panic could wait. I opened the filing cabinet and rested my hand on the top drawer, feeling the familiar weight beneath my fingers. 2 years of preparation. Not for revenge, for protection. I hadn't planned to destroy Linda. I had planned to survive her. I sat down in my chair and finally allowed myself to think about the moment that had changed everything. Not tonight. Not the papers. Not the laughter. That had just been the final act. The real beginning had been 2 years earlier, when I realized that love without respect becomes something hollow. When I understood that silence, while useful, had limits. My phone buzzed again, longer this time. A voicemail notification followed. I ignored it. Whatever was happening in that ballroom now was no longer my responsibility. I had paid for enough messes, cleaned up enough chaos, protected enough illusions. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room at the evidence of a life Linda never bothered to see. She thought I was walking away with nothing. The truth was everything that mattered had already followed me home. And somewhere across the city, the room that once laughed at me was beginning to understand what it meant when the wallet stood up and walked out. The light in my office hummed softly as it flickered on, revealing a room Linda had spent years pretending didn't exist. She said it was too dark, too serious, too dull. She preferred rooms with mirrors and soft edges, places that reflected her back at herself. This room reflected nothing. It simply held what was real. I closed the door and turned the lock. The sound was small, but it landed with weight. For decades, I had lived with every door open, every boundary flexible, every part of myself accessible. Tonight, that ended. The room smelled faintly of paper and old leather. The desk bore the marks of use, not decoration. Everything here served a purpose. I sat down slowly, feeling the chair accept my weight, and rested my hands on the surface in front of me. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the wood like an insect trapped under glass. I ignored it. Linda had never liked this room because it didn't flatter her. It didn't flatter anyone. It existed to function, not to impress. In hindsight, that was exactly why everything that mattered had ended up here. I reached for the filing cabinet to my right and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were folders arranged with quiet precision. Dates, labels, categories, not chaos, not emotion, just facts. I hadn't started collecting these because I wanted to hurt her. I started because I needed to understand what was happening to my life. There is a moment subtle and easy to miss when self-preservation begins to look like suspicion. That moment came for me 2 years ago, and once it did, I couldn't unsee it. The first folder was marked Financial Structure. I opened it and scanned the contents without reading every word. I didn't need to. I knew them by heart. Bank statements, ownership documents, account summaries. All the quiet proof of something Linda never bothered to ask about. She assumed money existed the way air did, infinite, unquestioned, hers by default. What she never understood was that air only feels infinite until it's cut off. I flipped to another section and paused at a familiar page. The brand registration, her brand, or rather, the illusion of it. A doing business as, a name, nothing more. No ownership, no foundation. The legal spine beneath it all bore my signature, not hers. She had rushed through the paperwork with excitement and impatience, waving away details saying lawyers slowed creativity. She trusted appearances. I trusted structure. The irony wasn't lost on me. She believed independence came from being seen. I knew it came from being prepared. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, opening the next one. Assets. This one was thicker, heavier. Years of work reduced to paper. Property records, investment summaries. Entities layered carefully, deliberately, each built with distance from emotion. Most of it wasn't joint. It never had been. Not because I was hiding anything, but because Linda had never shown interest in anything beyond access. She loved spending money. She loved choosing. She loved approving. She had no patience for planning risk management or restraint. When I tried to explain, her eyes glazed over. Numbers bored her. Consequences annoyed her. I stopped offering details, not out of secrecy, but out of exhaustion. I closed that folder too and sat back, letting the weight of it all settle. I thought of the countless times I had paid without question. Vacations I didn't want. Renovations I didn't need. Dinners I didn't enjoy. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself love meant giving. What I never realized was that love without limits teaches people exactly how much they can take. The phone buzzed again. Louder this time, more frantic. I glanced at the screen. Linda. 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails. I turned the phone face down. The next folder was the one I avoided for months before finally opening it. Personal. I took a breath before lifting it out. Not because it hurt, but because it disappointed. Inside were dates, locations, receipts, patterns that told a story I had suspected long before I proved it. I didn't need graphic detail. I didn't need to imagine anything. The truth was clinical and cold, stripped of romance or drama. The affair itself hadn't destroyed me. What destroyed me was how casually my trust had been treated, how easily my money had been used to fund betrayal. Hotel rooms, dinners, gifts, all charged to accounts I paid while she complained to friends that I was boring. I remembered the first time I saw proof. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. Once you see someone clearly, you can never go back to who you thought they were. I closed the folder and set it aside out of immediate reach. I wasn't here to relive pain. I was here to finish something. The last folder lay at the bottom of the drawer. Recordings. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I had listened to them once late at night, alone in this same chair. Her voice, casual, dismissive, laughing about me, talking about my usefulness, my predictability, how easy I was to manage. Love doesn't end when people leave. It ends when respect disappears. The phone buzzed again, followed by a message preview lighting up the screen. "Elias, please answer. Something's wrong." I almost smiled, not because she was panicking, but because she was finally experiencing the absence she had threatened me with for years. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to see the quiet street outside. The world looked unchanged. Cars passed. Lights flickered in distant windows. Somewhere people slept peacefully, unaware that an illusion was collapsing in a ballroom across town. For years I had protected Linda from consequences, paid her way out of discomfort, absorbed her mistakes, smoothed every edge she didn't want to face. Tonight I had simply stepped aside. I returned to the desk and sat down again, placing the folders back where they belonged. Order mattered, control mattered. Not to dominate, but to survive. My phone buzzed again, longer this time. A voicemail. I let it play without listening, watching the progress bar fill until it stopped. Then another came through. She would come home tonight. I knew that. Panic always drives people back to what they believe they own. I locked the cabinet and slid the key into my pocket. For the first time since this marriage began, I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't rehearsing explanations or preparing apologies. I wasn't calculating how to keep the peace. I was waiting. Whatever conversation was coming next would not happen on her terms. Not in her spotlight. Not with an audience ready to laugh. It would happen here in the room she never bothered to enter, surrounded by truths she never cared to understand. I heard the distant sound of a car slowing outside, tires on gravel, a door opening then slamming shut. I remained seated, hands folded, breathing steady. Linda's night had finally caught up with her, and for the first time I was exactly where I needed to be. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames in the hallway, a sharp crack that cut through the quiet like a gunshot. I didn't move. I stayed seated in the basement office, listening as Linda's heels struck the hardwood above me in fast, uneven rhythms. Panic always changed her gait. Confidence had weight and control. Fear rushed. "Elias," she called out, her voice tight, stretched thin by something she couldn't name yet. "Elias, where are you?" I waited until her footsteps crossed the living room, then the kitchen, then paused at the top of the basement stairs. She hated coming down here. Said it smelled like dust and old books. Said it felt like a bunker. She wasn't wrong. Her hand slammed against the railing. "Elias, answer me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm down here." The pause that followed was small, but telling. A recalibration. She descended slowly, one step at a time, heels tapping more carefully now as if she were entering unfamiliar territory. When she reached the bottom, she stopped short. The woman standing in front of me barely resembled the one who had stood under chandeliers an hour earlier. Her makeup was smeared. Her hair, once sculpted into perfection, was loose and fraying. The confidence she wore like armor at the launch had cracked, and what stood beneath it was brittle and afraid. "What did you do?" she demanded. But the force behind the words was gone. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. I left the party. Her laugh came out sharp and humorless. "Don't play games with me. Vendors are calling." The hotel threatened to shut down the event. The models were pulled backstage. Someone said the police were on their way because a contract dispute escalated. "What did you do?" "I stopped paying for things I don't own," I said calmly. She took a step closer, eyes scanning the room as if answers might be hiding on the walls. "You can't just do that. That brand is mine." I turned the monitor toward her and tapped a key. The screen lit up with documents she had never bothered to read. Registrations, ownership filings, the trademark. She stared at it, blinking rapidly. "That's not possible." "I registered everything myself." "You registered a name," I replied, "a DBA. That gives you the right to use it, not own it." Her mouth opened, then closed. "You're lying." I shook my head. "You never asked." She moved closer to the desk now, anger rising as fear searched for a place to anchor itself. "You did this on purpose. You waited until tonight." "I waited until you told me who you thought I was," I said. "You did that very clearly." She scoffed, but it sounded hollow. "This is just a stunt. You're embarrassed, so you're punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm correcting an assumption." Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it, then tossed it onto the desk like it burned. "I don't have time for this. Fix it. Call whoever you need to call." I looked at her for a long moment. The entitlement was still there, stripped of polish, but intact. "That's not how this works anymore." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean anymore?" I reached into the drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. "This is how it works." She flipped it open and scanned the first page, then the second. Her breathing quickened. "What is this reality?" I said. "The house, the accounts, the investments. They're not joint." Her head snapped up. "We're married." "Yes," I agreed, "and for almost 3 decades you let me handle everything because you didn't care how it was built." "Only that it was there." Her voice dropped. "You're saying I have nothing. I'm saying you never had control," I corrected. "You had access." She laughed then, but it broke halfway through. "This is insane. You can't just take everything away." "I didn't take anything," I said. I stopped pretending. Her hands trembled as she pushed the folder back toward me. "I'll call my lawyer." "I already spoke to mine," I replied. 2 years ago. That stopped her cold. "You planned this," she whispered. "I prepared," I said. "There's a difference." She sank into the chair across from me, suddenly smaller shoulders folding inward. "You're trying to destroy me." I leaned forward slightly. "No, I'm letting you face the consequences of choices you made while assuming I'd absorb them." Her eyes flicked to the filing cabinet behind me. "What else is in there?" I didn't answer right away. "Silence can be instructive." "Enough." She swallowed. "You recorded me." "I documented what I needed to understand," I said. "Your spending, your lies, your affair." Her face drained of color. "You don't have proof." I opened another folder and slid out a single receipt. A hotel. Her signature. My card. She didn't touch it. She didn't have to. The truth had weight all its own. "You went through my things," she said weakly. "You charged betrayal to my account," I replied. Her voice cracked. You're supposed to protect me. I studied her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but distance. I protected you from reality for years. That wasn't love, that was avoidance. She shook her head. We can fix this. We'll renegotiate. I'll give you credit. I'll say you were behind everything. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. You already told everyone who you thought I was. She reached for me, then fingers brushing my sleeve. Elias, please. I didn't mean it. I stepped back. You meant it enough to say it out loud. Her shoulders began to shake. Tears came fast now, uncontrolled. I don't know how to live without this. I paused, then spoke quietly. That's the problem. You never learned how. She looked around the room again, as if seeing it for the first time. The books, the files, the tools of a life built without applause. Who are you? She asked. I'm the man you never bothered to know, I said. The sound of sirens drifted faintly through the night air, outside distant but unmistakable. Her head snapped toward the ceiling. Is that for me? I shook my head. It's for the mess you left behind. She stood abruptly, backing toward the stairs. This isn't over. I met her gaze steadily. It is. She turned and fled up the steps, her heels clattering wildly. Now no rhythm left at all. I sat back down and listened as the house settled into silence once more. The sirens faded. The phone stopped buzzing. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Morning came without mercy. The sun rose exactly as it always had, spilling pale light through the kitchen windows, indifferent to the fact that everything had changed overnight. I sat at the small breakfast table nursing a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, listening to the house breathe. The ticking clock. The hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary sounds in a home that no longer belonged to both of us. Linda did not come downstairs. That too was familiar. Whenever reality pressed too hard, she retreated. Silence had always been her way of pretending things would resolve themselves if she waited long enough. For years I had let that strategy work. I filled the gaps. I solved the problems. I made sure life stayed comfortable while she avoided discomfort. Not anymore. My phone lit up with a new message. Not from her. Unknown number. Elias Ward, this is the Midtown Grand Hotel Events Office. We need to speak with you immediately regarding unpaid balances and contractual disputes from last night's event. I exhaled slowly and set the phone down. It had begun. I wasn't surprised. The moment the accounts froze, the illusion cracked. Vendors don't argue with charm. They argue with contracts and invoices. And Linda had signed many of them under the assumption that money would appear because it always had. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and left it upside down in the sink. Small habits matter when everything else feels unstable. Then I went back downstairs, unlocked the filing cabinet, and pulled out a slim folder marked Communications. Inside were prepared responses. Not excuses, not apologies. Statements, boundaries. I returned the call. Mr. Ward, the woman said quickly, relief obvious in her voice. Thank you for getting back to us. There's been some confusion. There hasn't, I interrupted gently. The accounts associated with the event were suspended due to ownership verification issues. A pause, papers rustling. Mrs. Ward assured us everything was in order. I'm sure she did, I said. She no longer has authorization. Silence stretched on the line. So, what happens now? The woman asked carefully. That depends on how quickly your legal department reviews the documents I sent this morning, I replied. Until then, I suggest you direct all inquiries to Mrs. Ward. I ended the call before she could respond. The phone buzzed again, this time with Linda's name. I didn't answer. I dressed deliberately. No suit, no performance. Just pressed slacks and a sweater I liked, one she had once called dull. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror before leaving the house. 60 years old, lines around my eyes, gray threading through my hair. For the first time, I didn't look tired. Outside, the air was crisp. Manhattan hummed in the distance, unaware that a small financial earthquake was rippling outward from a single ballroom. I drove not toward the office Linda thought I had, but toward the one she didn't know existed. The building was unremarkable from the street. Clean, discreet. No name on the door, just a number. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and polished stone. The receptionist looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Mr. Ward. They're ready for you." The conference room upstairs was already occupied. 3 people sat around the table, laptops open, expressions focused but calm. These were the people who knew my real life. The one built quietly, without applause. "Rough night," one of them asked lightly. "Productive," I replied, taking my seat. We didn't waste time. Screens lit up, reports loaded, overnight summaries scrolled past, frozen accounts, flagged transactions, calls logged. Linda's name appeared repeatedly attached to escalating messages marked urgent. "She's trying to access personal lines of credit," another said. All denied. I nodded, as expected, and the trademark reversion is processing. By tomorrow morning, her legal claim will be null. No satisfaction, just confirmation. Then came the part that surprised even me. "There's media interest," the third said, turning his screen. "Small blogs, fashion insiders, rumors about police presence last night." I raised an eyebrow. "Any direct mentions?" "Not yet. Just speculation. Financial mismanagement, vendor disputes." "Let it stay that way," I said. "No statements, no corrections." They nodded. They understood discretion. As the meeting wrapped, my phone buzzed again. "Linda." Voicemail. I listened to it in the elevator on the way down. Her voice was different now. Lower, shaken. "Elias, please, I need help. The bank won't release anything. My cards aren't working. People are calling me. I don't know what's happening. Call me back." I deleted the message without responding. By noon, the second wave hit. Her sister, then her mother, then a friend I barely recognized by name. Each call followed the same pattern. Confusion, accusation, pleas. I answered none of them. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was empty. Linda's car was gone. So were several suitcases from the closet. She had left in a hurry, taking what she could carry and assuming the rest would wait for negotiation. On the kitchen counter, she had left a note. "This is cruel. You're punishing me for being honest." I folded it once and placed it in the drawer with the rest of the evidence. Honesty isn't cruelty. It's clarity delivered without cushioning. The next call came just after sunset. A lawyer this time. Polite, cautious, fishing for leverage. "We're hoping to resolve this amicably," he said. "I am too," I replied. "That's why everything is documented." A pause. Mrs. Ward is under the impression she's entitled to support. I leaned back against the counter, watching the sky darken beyond the window. Mrs. Ward is adjusting to the difference between entitlement and ownership. Cut. Silence. "We'll review the materials," he said carefully. "Please do," I replied and ended the call. That night I sat alone in the living room, with the lights off, city glow filtering through the windows. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. For years my life had revolved around maintaining a fiction. That Linda's success was independent. That our marriage was balanced. That love meant endurance. The truth was simpler. I had been useful. And when usefulness ended, so did affection. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unfamiliar number. "I didn't know who you really were." I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "Neither did you." I set the phone aside and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring negotiations, accusations, stories rewritten for sympathy. But tonight the silence belonged to me. And for the first time in a very long time, I slept without fear of what I might lose. Because everything worth keeping was finally on my side. The first settlement letter arrived 3 days later, thick and formal, delivered by courier as if weight alone could intimidate me. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the kitchen counter and went about my morning as usual. Coffee, a slice of toast. The paper folded neatly unread, waiting its turn like everything else that no longer controlled my pace. By the time I did open it, I already knew what it would say. Entitlement dressed up as inevitability. A request framed as a right. 28 years of marriage cited as if time itself were proof of contribution. The language was careful, polished, meant to sound reasonable to someone still afraid of conflict. I wasn't. I read it once slowly, then slid it into a folder already labeled settlement attempts. There would be more. My phone rang as if on cue, a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Ward," a woman said, brisk but warm. "This is Rebecca Hollis. I represent Linda." "I assumed as much," I replied. A brief pause. "We'd like to resolve this quickly and privately." "So would I," I said. "That depends on expectations." She cleared her throat. "Linda is asking for transitional support. A modest amount. Given the length of the marriage, it's standard. Standard doesn't apply when the foundation doesn't exist," I said calmly. Another pause, longer this time. "She sacrificed her earning potential." "She opted out of earning," I replied. "Those aren't the same thing." Silence pressed through the line. I imagined her glancing at notes, recalibrating strategy. "She's under significant stress," Rebecca said carefully. "Her reputation has taken a hit. There are rumors." I looked out the window at the quiet street. Rumors thrive where clarity is absent. "You have the documents. Use them." "You're being firm," she said. "I'm being accurate." She sighed. "If this goes to court—" "It won't," I interrupted. "Not if you've reviewed what I sent." I ended the call before she could respond. By midweek, Linda tried a different approach. She showed up. I heard her before I saw her. The car door slamming. Footsteps on the walkway. The doorbell rang twice, sharp and impatient. I didn't rush. I set my book down, marked the page, and stood. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. No makeup, hair pulled back hastily. A coat she'd owned for years, worn thin at the cuffs. "We need to talk," she said, breathless. "We are," I replied, stepping aside. She hesitated, then entered. Her eyes moved through the living room as if expecting it to accuse her. Nothing had changed. That unsettled her. "I'm not here to fight," she said quickly. "I just want to understand what you're doing." I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Sit." She didn't. She paced instead, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Everyone thinks I ruined everything. They don't know the whole story." I waited. "You could fix this," she continued. "One statement, one call, just say there was a misunderstanding." "I won't lie," I said. Her eyes flashed. "You're punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm refusing to rescue you." She stopped pacing. "You always rescued me. That was the problem." Her voice cracked. I didn't think it would end like this. I looked at her, then really looked. "It ended long before last week. You just didn't notice?" She sat down finally, shoulders slumping. "I don't have access to anything. My cards, the accounts, even my phone plan is about to be cut off. You'll need to arrange your own finances," I said. She laughed weakly. With what I didn't answer. She leaned forward, desperation sharpening her tone. "I gave you my life." "No," I replied. "You spent mine." Her face hardened. "You're cruel. I'm consistent." She stood abruptly. "If you don't help me, I'll make this ugly." I met her gaze steadily. "If you try, it will become public." She swallowed. "You wouldn't." "I already did," I said softly. "I just did it quietly." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and flinched, then shoved it into her pocket. "This isn't over." "It is," I said. She left without another word. That evening, the second letter arrived. Different tone, softer, language adjusted, numbers smaller. Progress. 2 days later, a third, then a fourth. Each one conceded a little more ground. My lawyer reviewed them with growing amusement. "They're retreating," he said. "Slowly, painfully." "Good," I replied. "They're learning." The real turning point came when the audit report landed. An independent review of the brand's finances. Every expense traced, every assumption exposed. The result was devastating, not because of malice, but because of negligence. The report concluded with a single line that said everything. The business lacked independent capitalization and was wholly dependent on personal funds not legally accessible to the named operator. Translation: it was never hers. That document changed everything. Within 24 hours, Rebecca called again. "We're prepared to revise the offer," she said. To what I asked, "Linda will walk away with personal effects only. No support, no claim to assets. In exchange, she requests a non-disparagement agreement." I considered it for a moment. "I'll agree not to speak. I won't agree to silence truth." "That may be acceptable," she said carefully. "It is," I replied. The final meeting was brief. Linda didn't look at me as she signed. Her hand shook. When she slid the papers back across the table, she whispered, "I didn't know you were capable of this." I met her eyes. "Neither did you." She left without asking where she would go. When the door closed behind her, the room felt lighter, not empty, clear. That night I sat alone with a glass of water and thought about everything that had been mistaken for love. Accommodation, silence, endurance. None of it was love. Love doesn't require erasure. The phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "You won. I hope it was worth it." I typed back slowly. I didn't win. I stopped losing. I set the phone aside and turned out the light. Tomorrow the story would continue without her. And for the first time it would be written without fear. The silence that followed the agreement was louder than any argument we'd ever had. It settled into the house like dust, coating everything, evenly leaving no place to hide. For years, noise had filled our lives. Conversations that weren't really conversations. Complaints disguised as observations. Praise offered only in public, criticism delivered in private. Now there was nothing. Just space. I woke early as I always had, but without the familiar knot in my chest. No anticipation of conflict. No mental checklist of what needed to be fixed before Linda noticed it was broken. I made coffee and stood at the window watching the city wake up, feeling something unfamiliar, but welcome. Relief. By mid-morning, the consequences began to ripple outward in ways Linda had never anticipated. The fashion world, I learned quickly, has a short memory and a shorter tolerance for instability. Designers are celebrated for vision, but investors demand structure. Vendors demand payment. Once the truth surfaced quietly and without drama, interest evaporated. I didn't seek updates. They came to me anyway. Emails forwarded by my lawyer, calls summarized by assistants, articles framed carefully avoiding names but painting a clear picture. A promising brand halted due to internal financial issues. A launch marred by mismanagement. Partnerships reconsidered. Linda's name wasn't dragged through the mud. It didn't need to be. Absence spoke louder than accusation. I drove past the hotel where the launch had taken place one afternoon, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. The banners were gone. The windows reflected only traffic and sky. It looked smaller than I remembered. So did everything that once intimidated me. At home, I began the slow process of reclaiming space. Not redecorating, not erasing, just choosing. I boxed up things that had been purchased to impress people who never mattered. Artwork selected for price tags rather than meaning. Furniture arranged for photos rather than comfort. Each item I removed felt less like loss and more like correction. One afternoon, while sorting through the study upstairs, I found an old notebook buried in a drawer. Mine. From years ago. I flipped through pages filled with ideas I'd abandoned. Investments I never pursued because they sounded boring to someone who valued spectacle over substance. I sat on the floor and read until the light faded. It wasn't regret I felt. It was recognition. I hadn't failed to become someone. I had postponed him. The phone rang while I was still sitting there. A number I knew well. Elias, my lawyer, said, his tone lighter than usual. "You should know something." I listened. She tried to open a new account, claimed she had backing. It didn't work. I closed the notebook. I expected that. "There's more. She's telling people she was blindsided, that you hid everything." I smiled faintly. "Let her." Silence stretched on the line. "You're not worried, no?" I said. "Truth doesn't rush." After the call ended, I went back to the notebook and tore out a single page. An idea I'd written years ago, dismissed because it lacked glamour. It was practical, sustainable, quietly profitable. I placed it on the desk and made a call of my own. The meeting took place a week later in a modest office overlooking the river. No signage, no reception desk designed to impress, just clean lines and capable people. They listened, really listened. As I spoke, I felt something shift. Not excitement. Alignment. The kind that comes when your words aren't being filtered through someone else's insecurity. "We can build this," one of them said. Slowly. Properly. I nodded. "That's the only way I know how." Outside, the water moved steadily past the windows, indifferent to ambition or regret. It reminded me that progress doesn't announce itself. It persists. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different again. Lighter, less like a stage, and more like shelter. I cooked dinner for myself, something simple. Ate at the table instead of the counter. Small changes, but deliberate. Later, as I washed the dishes, my phone buzzed. A message from Linda's sister. "She's not doing well. She says you destroyed her life." I dried my hands and typed back slowly. "I didn't destroy anything. I stopped maintaining a lie." There was no response. Weeks passed. The city moved on, so did I. I took long walks in the mornings, not to clear my head, but because I enjoyed them. I noticed things I'd ignored for years. A cafe that knew my order. A park bench that caught the afternoon sun just right. Freedom, I learned, isn't loud. It's spacious. One evening, while reviewing documents at my desk, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Linda, not at myself. Anger requires energy, and I no longer felt compelled to spend any on the past. What remained was resolve. I closed the folder in front of me and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For decades, I had measured success by stability, keeping things together, preventing collapse. Now I understood something better. Success isn't what you preserve. It's what you're willing to rebuild once you stop pretending. My phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Another small article. Another quiet mention. A former designer seeking new opportunities after a failed venture. No accusations, no drama, just consequence. I turned off the phone and stood walking to the window. The city lights shimmered below, countless lives intersecting, diverging, continuing. Somewhere out there, Linda was telling her version of the story. Somewhere else, people were deciding whether to believe it. It no longer mattered. I had my own work to do. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, every step forward belonged entirely to me. Change didn't arrive with fireworks or announcements. It arrived disguised as routine. I began noticing it in the quiet moments, the ones that used to feel empty. Mornings no longer carried a sense of bracing myself for disappointment. Evenings didn't feel like something to endure. The absence of tension created space, and space, I learned, has a way of inviting truth. I returned to the office Linda never knew about, more often not out of urgency, but intention. The conversations there were different from anything I'd experienced in years. No one asked me to justify myself. No one needed reassurance disguised as flattery. People spoke in terms of structured timelines, risk, and accountability. Words that once bored Linda now felt like oxygen. One afternoon, after a long meeting that ended with quiet consensus rather than applause, I lingered behind. The others filtered out phones already pressed to ears, minds moving forward. I stayed seated, staring at the whiteboard, still marked with plans we had just agreed to. This was the life I had been building in fragments, always postponing it for someone else's comfort. I erased the board slowly, line by line, not because the plan was flawed, but because I wanted to rewrite it in my own hand. Later that day, I received an email forwarded by my lawyer. Linda's name appeared in the subject line, though she hadn't written it herself. Request for mediation, revision. I didn't open it immediately. There was a time when seeing her name would have tightened something in my chest. Now, it felt like looking at an old address I no longer lived at. Familiar, but irrelevant. When I did read it, the tone had shifted again. Less accusation, more exhaustion. She was asking to revisit the non-disparagement clause. She wanted the freedom to tell her story. I forwarded it back with a single line. You're free to speak. I'm not responsible for belief. That was the truth. Control ends when integrity begins. The next message came from an unexpected source. A woman I recognized vaguely from past social gatherings, someone Linda had once introduced as important. I didn't realize who you were married to, the message read. I'm sorry. I didn't respond. Apologies offered too late often serve the giver more than the recipient. What surprised me most during that period was not how quickly Linda's world shrank, but how little effort it took to stop being part of it. Once I stepped out of the role she'd written for me, the script collapsed on its own. One evening, I found myself walking through a bookstore near my apartment. I hadn't planned to be there. I simply wandered in, drawn by the quiet. I browsed without purpose, pulling volumes from shelves, reading passages at random. In the business section, I found a title I'd read years ago and dismissed because it lacked glamour. I flipped it open and smiled. The ideas felt familiar now, grounded, patient. At the counter, the clerk asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I think so, I replied. On the way home, my phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time. Linda's voice, different than before. Tired, careful. I don't expect you to fix anything, she said. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to figure things out on my own. I didn't realize how much I leaned on you. I listened without interruption, then deleted the message. Acknowledgement doesn't require reconciliation. That night, I cooked dinner for a friend I hadn't seen in years. Someone Linda never liked because he asked too many questions. We sat at the table eating slowly, talking about nothing and everything. You seem lighter, he said, studying me. I am, I replied. He nodded. I always wondered why you stayed. So did I said honestly. After he left, I stood in the kitchen, rinsing plates, thinking about how often we mistake endurance for virtue. How easily loyalty becomes a cage when it isn't mutual. The following week, I finalized the first step of a new venture. Nothing flashy. Just a signed agreement and a modest transfer of funds. Enough to begin, enough to matter. When I told the team, there were no cheers. Just nods. A shared understanding of responsibility. That felt better than any applause I'd ever heard. The news reached Linda faster than I expected. A mutual acquaintance called, voice lowered conspiratorially. I heard you're doing something new. She's furious. I laughed softly. She doesn't own my future. She thinks you're trying to erase her. I'm trying to live, I said. The call ended awkwardly, as they often did when people realized they were standing between two versions of a story. That weekend, I returned to the old house for the last time to collect the final boxes. It was quieter than I remembered. Emptier. The echoes lingered longer. In the bedroom, the closet stood half bare. Linda had taken what she valued, left behind what she couldn't sell or carry. I found a framed photo tucked behind a drawer, a vacation from years ago. We were smiling, but even then something about it felt staged. I placed it face down in the box and taped it shut. Some memories don't deserve display. As I locked the door behind me, I didn't look back. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. The city greeted me with its usual indifference. Traffic, noise, life continuing at its own pace. I blended into it easily, no longer needing to perform. That night, as I sat at my desk reviewing plans for the coming months, I felt something settle into place. Purpose. Not borrowed, not reactive, chosen. Linda had believed power came from being seen, from commanding attention, from controlling narratives. She was wrong. Real power is quiet. It's built in rooms no one cares to enter. It waits, it endures. And when the moment comes, it doesn't announce itself. It simply steps forward. I closed the folder in front of me and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new risks. But they would be mine, and for the first time, that was enough. The first formal hearing was scheduled on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that made the city feel heavier than usual. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted to sit with the moment before it happened. Courtrooms have a way of compressing time, years of choices reduced to hours of argument. I took a seat on the wooden bench and watched people file in, each carrying their own version of truth. Linda arrived 10 minutes late. She looked different again, not frantic this time, controlled. Her hair was neat, her posture straight. She had chosen a navy dress that suggested seriousness, humility, and restraint. It was the same instinct that had guided her wardrobe choices for years. Dress for the role you want people to believe you're playing. She didn't look at me. Her attorney whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, eyes fixed straight ahead. I wondered briefly if she believed the performance herself. Then the judge entered, and the room stood. The proceedings began with procedural formalities, the language sterile and detached. Dates, names, filings, everything spoken as if this were a simple transaction rather than the autopsy of a marriage. Linda's attorney spoke first. She painted a picture of sacrifice, of emotional labor, of years spent supporting a husband who, according to her narrative, had quietly accumulated power while keeping his wife in the dark. It was a familiar story designed to evoke sympathy without inviting scrutiny. I listened without interruption. Then it was my turn. My lawyer stood and spoke calmly, deliberately. He did not raise his voice. He did not attack. He laid out facts the way one lays stones across a river, each placed carefully, making the crossing inevitable. Ownership structures, financial records, signed documents, Linda's own emails submitted without commentary. The timeline unfolded not as accusation, but as explanation. I watched the judge's expression change almost imperceptibly. Linda shifted in her seat. When the recordings were mentioned, she flinched. Not because she feared exposure, but because she recognized herself in a way she could no longer deny. The woman on those recordings was not misunderstood. She was unfiltered. The judge asked questions. Direct ones, uncomfortable ones. "Mrs. Ward," he said, looking at Linda over his glasses, "were you aware that the business was registered as a DBA and not a separate legal entity under your ownership?" She hesitated. "I handled the creative side." "That wasn't my question," he replied. Silence stretched. Then quietly, "No." The room seemed to exhale. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Ward, when did you establish the majority of these assets?" I answered simply. "Over the last decade, with income earned independently." "And did your wife participate in these ventures?" "No," I said. She showed no interest. Linda's attorney objected weakly, but the moment had passed. The narrative had cracked. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a preliminary ruling. No immediate support, no claim to business assets, further review scheduled, but the direction was clear. Linda's shoulders slumped as if something inside her had finally given way. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Not many. Just enough to create pressure. Microphones hovered. Questions were shouted. I walked past them without comment. Linda didn't. She stopped, offered a brief statement about privacy and healing, then hurried away. The cameras followed her. I stepped into the cool air and felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Closure. Later that afternoon, my lawyer called. "They'll settle," he said. This took the wind out of them. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Good. That evening, I received a message from Linda. Not through lawyers. Direct. I never thought it would come to this. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Neither did I. That's why I prepared. There was no response. The settlement offer arrived the next morning. Clean, conclusive. No support, no claims. A mutual release and silence clause that favored truth over narrative. I signed it without hesitation. When it was done, I sat at my desk and stared at the document, feeling the finality settle in my bones. This was not an ending I had imagined, but it was an honest one. Linda had built her life on visibility, on applause, on the belief that perception was power. When perception turned against her, there was nothing underneath to hold the structure. I had built mine quietly, patiently, without recognition. And when the lights went out, it stood. That realization did not make me proud. It made me grateful. Grateful that I had trusted my instincts when they whispered instead of shouted. Grateful that I had learned the difference between generosity and self-erasure. Grateful that I had stopped confusing endurance with love. That night I took a long walk through the city, past restaurants filled with laughter, past storefronts glowing warmly against the dark. Life continuing, indifferent to personal collapse or quiet victory. I felt small in the best possible way. The phone buzzed once more. A final message from Linda. "I hope you find what you're looking for." I typed back carefully. "I already have." I slipped the phone into my pocket and kept walking. The future didn't feel triumphant. It felt open. And for the first time, that was enough. The days after the settlement felt strangely weightless, as if gravity had adjusted without warning. I no longer woke up thinking about what I owed anyone, emotionally or financially. The quiet that once felt unnatural now felt earned. I moved through my routines with intention rather than habit, noticing how much energy I had been spending simply anticipating Linda's reactions. Without that constant calculation, time expanded. I returned to work fully, not as an escape, but as an expression of choice. Meetings were efficient. Decisions were deliberate. The people around me spoke plainly, unconcerned with appearances. It was refreshing in a way I hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a long strategy session that ended exactly on time, I stayed behind in the conference room, reviewing notes. The glass walls reflected my image, faintly older than I used to see myself, but steadier. The man looking back at me wasn't triumphant. He was resolved. A knock came at the door. "Got a minute?" she asked. I nodded. "Of course." She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. We'd worked together for years, though, always at a distance. She had been present through the unraveling, never intrusive, never performative. Competent, observant. I wanted to say something, she began, about everything that happened. I waited. "You handled it with more restraint than most people would have," she said. "Especially given how public it could have become." "It wasn't restraint," I replied. "It was preservation." She smiled faintly. "That might be even harder." We talked briefly about work, then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A pause that wasn't awkward, just unspoken understanding. When she left, I didn't overthink it. For once, I let a moment exist without assigning it meaning. That evening, I walked home instead of driving. The city was alive with movement, couples passing, laughter spilling out of restaurants, lives intersecting briefly before diverging again. I felt no envy, just awareness. At home, I cooked dinner and ate slowly, listening to music I liked without worrying if it suited anyone else's taste. Small freedoms accumulate. They change you. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I hadn't saved. It was Linda. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I didn't know who else to tell this to, she wrote. I moved out of my sister's place. I'm renting a room. It's different. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood what she was really asking for. Validation, rescue, relevance. I typed carefully. I hope you find stability. That matters. The reply came quickly. That's it, I considered the question before answering. That's all I have to give. The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. No more messages came. I set the phone down and felt nothing but calm. The next few weeks unfolded quietly. Linda's name appeared less and less in my thoughts, not because I was suppressing anything, but because my life had filled the space she once occupied. I traveled for work, short trips, purposeful. No grand hotels chosen for image, just places that felt comfortable. I slept well, woke early, took notes in the mornings, walked in the evenings. One night, after a late return, I found myself sitting across from her again, sharing a meal. No expectations, no history to navigate, just conversation that didn't feel like a negotiation. You seem different, she said, studying me over her glass. I am, I replied simply. She nodded, in a good way. I didn't rush anything. I had learned what happens when you confuse momentum with meaning. Weeks later, a small article crossed my screen. Linda had taken a position at a boutique firm. Not glamorous, entry level. The tone was sympathetic. She was described as resilient rebuilding. I closed the article and moved on. Rebuilding is not a performance. It's work done quietly without witnesses. As autumn settled in, the city changed color. Leaves fell, air sharpened. I felt aligned with the season, shedding what no longer served me, conserving energy for what mattered. One evening, standing at my window, I realized something profound. I wasn't waiting for the next chapter. I was living it. There were no grand declarations, no revenge fantasies fulfilled, no moment where I stood above the wreckage and felt powerful. Instead, there was peace, and that I understood now was the rarest outcome of all. The first snow came early that year, light and tentative, dusting the city as if testing whether it would be welcomed. I stood at the window and watched it fall, feeling a quiet satisfaction I couldn't have named months earlier. Winter had always made Linda restless. She hated anything that slowed her down, anything that required patience. For me, it felt like permission to breathe. The new routine had settled into my bones. Mornings began with intention instead of obligation. I read more. I listened more. I spoke only when I meant it. Somewhere along the way, I stopped explaining myself to people who had never bothered to understand me. Work continued to grow, not explosively, but steadily. The venture I'd revived from that old notebook was gaining traction. Nothing flashy, no press releases, just consistent returns and quiet interest from people who valued substance over spectacle. Every meeting felt grounded. No one mistook charm for competence. No one confused confidence with entitlement. One afternoon, after a long discussion about long-term positioning, I found myself alone in the office, staring at a projection of the next 5 years. The numbers made sense. The risks were calculated. For the first time, the future felt like something I was building for myself, not something I was maintaining for someone else. My phone buzzed. It was Linda's name again. I didn't flinch this time. I didn't feel the old tightening in my chest. I answered. "Elias," she said quietly, "I won't keep you long." "I'm listening," I replied. There was a pause, not the manipulative kind, the uncertain kind. "I start work tomorrow," she said. "It's not what I imagined my life would be. I imagine it rarely is," I said gently. She let out a small breath. I wanted to say something, not to change anything, just to say it. I waited. I thought power was something you took, she said. I thought if I became visible enough, admired enough, everything else would follow. And now I asked. And now I realize I was standing on something. I didn't build, she said. When it disappeared, I didn't know how to stand. Her honesty surprised me. Not because it was profound, but because it was late. I'm learning, she added quickly. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I see it now. I leaned back in my chair, considering my response carefully. Seeing something doesn't undo it, I said. But it can change what comes next. Do you hate me? She asked. The question was sincere, vulnerable. No, I said truthfully, I don't. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I hope you're well, she said finally. I am, I replied. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone resting in my hand. I felt no urge to analyze the conversation, no need to replay it for meaning. It had been what it was. An acknowledgement, not an absolution. That night I walked through the city, the snow crunching softly under my shoes. Holiday lights were beginning to appear in windows. People hurried past with packages and plans. I felt oddly detached from the urgency of it all, not isolated, just unburdened. I stopped at a cafe and ordered tea sitting near the window. Across the street, a woman laughed as she struggled to open an umbrella against the falling snow. Her companion reached over and helped, their movements uncoordinated but affectionate. It struck me then how easily love is mistaken for performance. How often we applaud the loudest gestures while missing the quiet ones that actually hold people up. Back home, I sorted through old files, not because I needed to, but because I wanted closure. I found letters Linda had written early in our marriage. Notes filled with optimism, ambition, affection. They weren't lies. They were intentions that had never been matched by discipline. I placed them in a box and sealed it. The past didn't need to be destroyed. It just needed to be contained. Weeks passed. Snow melted. Winter softened. The city shifted again. One evening after dinner with colleagues, I returned home and sat alone in the living room, lights, dim music playing softly. I realized I wasn't waiting for companionship. I was open-scawed to it, but not dependent on it. That distinction mattered. I thought back to the man I had been at the beginning of all this. The one standing in an elevator feeling invisible. The one holding divorce papers in a room full of strangers. The one who walked out quietly because he knew noise would only weaken him. That man had survived. The man I was now had learned. My phone buzzed with a final message from Linda sent hours after our call. Thank you for answering. I won't reach out again. I typed a response, then erased it. Some endings don't need commentary. I set the phone down and stood walking to the window once more. The city lights reflected back at me, steady and calm. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of something. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The morning I signed the final document felt no different from any other, and that was how I knew it was real. No surge of emotion, no cinematic release. Just a pen moving across paper, my name written clearly, deliberately, without hesitation. When it was done, the lawyer slid the folder away and nodded once. That was it. Nearly 3 decades of marriage reduced to a stack of pages and a quiet understanding that nothing more needed to be said. I stepped outside into the winter air and stood there for a moment, letting the cold bite gently at my face. The city moved around me as it always had. People hurried past. Cars honked. Somewhere someone laughed too loudly. Life didn't pause for endings. It never had. On the walk home, I thought about the version of myself who had once believed silence meant weakness, who thought endurance was proof of love, who believed that being useful was the same as being valued. I understood now how wrong I had been. Silence can be strength when it's chosen. Endurance can be self-betrayal when it's one-sided. And usefulness without respect is just another form of erasure. At home, I opened the windows despite the cold and let fresh air fill the rooms. The space no longer felt like something I was maintaining. It felt like something I inhabited. Every object inside it had been chosen with intention. Nothing remained simply because it had always been there. I brewed coffee and sat at the table watching steam rise from the mug. For years, mornings had begun with tension I pretended not to feel. Now they began with stillness. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't scanning for signs of displeasure. I wasn't calculating what I needed to fix before the day officially started. I was simply present. Later that afternoon, I took a long walk along the river. The water moved steadily, unconcerned with the drama of human lives. It reminded me that time doesn't judge. It carries everything forward equally. What matters is what you choose to carry with it. I thought about Linda not with anger, not even with sadness, but with clarity. She had believed power came from being admired, from being seen, from standing in the light. She had mistaken attention for security and visibility for value. I had believed love meant staying quiet and paying the cost. We were both wrong. The truth sat somewhere in between, waiting patiently for one of us to notice. As I walked, I passed couples arguing softly, friends laughing loudly, strangers lost in their own thoughts, everyone carrying something invisible, everyone making choices they would one day have to answer for. I wondered how many people were still standing where I had once stood, shrinking themselves to keep peace, convincing themselves that being overlooked was the price of loyalty. I wished I could tell them what I knew now. That dignity doesn't require permission. That self-respect doesn't announce itself. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining who you are to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. When I returned home, the light was fading. I turned on a lamp and sat at my desk opening a notebook I had begun keeping since everything changed. Not a journal of grievances or victories, but a record of decisions. Choices made consciously instead of by default. On the last page, I wrote a single sentence. I will not abandon myself again. I closed the notebook and leaned back, letting the silence settle around me. It no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The phone buzzed once, a notification from a news app, a brief mention of a former designer pivoting to a new path. No name, no drama. Just a footnote in a world that had already moved on. I smiled faintly and turned the phone off. That chapter was closed. What came next wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and far more satisfying. Freedom. Not the loud kind that demands an audience, but the steady kind that shows up every morning when you wake up knowing you no longer owe your life to someone else's approval. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, maybe it's because some part of it felt familiar. Maybe you've been the one quietly holding everything together while being treated as invisible. Maybe you've been told that patience is the same thing as love, that silence is the same thing as loyalty, that your worth depends on how much you give without complaint. If that's you, let me say this clearly. Imlang kumfaila kamchu. Sometimes it's preparation. And preparation, when paired with self-respect, changes everything. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what part stayed with you the most. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply let me know you were here. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, earned justice, and reclaiming dignity after betrayal, stay with me. Subscribe and walk this road together. Some endings are loud. The ones that matter most are the ones that finally let you stand in your own life unafraid.